The brutal execution of William Wallace was far more horrific than you imagine. Forget the heroic death you may have seen in a film. The end of William Wallace was not a noble sacrifice. It was a cold, calculated spectacle of state-sanctioned terror. That final, defiant cry of freedom is a powerful piece of fiction, but the reality on the 23rd of August, 1305, was far less cinematic and infinitely more savage. The English crown, under the unyielding rule of King Edward I, didn't just want Wallace dead, they wanted him erased. They wanted him systematically dismantled, piece by piece, in the most public and degrading way imaginable. His execution was to be a meticulously staged performance, designed to annihilate not only a man's body, but also his reputation and the very idea of Scottish freedom he had come to represent. Yet, in their quest to make a terrifying example of a rebel, they inadvertently forged a martyr. This is the brutal, unvarnished truth of William Wallace's final hours. Before the physical torment began, there was the ultimate betrayal. For years, William Wallace had been the most wanted man in Britain. Following his defeat at the Battle of Falkirk in 1298, his stature was diminished, but his defiance was not. He resigned as Guardian of Scotland, but refused to submit to English rule, becoming a phantom of the resistance and a constant thorn in King Edward's side. Edward offered clemency to many Scottish nobles who bent the knee, but never to Wallace. He was the one man who had to be broken. The end finally came on August 5, 1305, near Glasgow. A Scottish knight loyal to Edward, Sir John de Menteith, betrayed Wallace to English soldiers. The great rebel was at last in chains. He was transported hundreds of miles south to London, destined for a trial that was a mere formality. He was brought to Westminster Hall, not for a legal proceeding, but for a show trial. This was political theater of the highest order. He was denied counsel and forbidden from speaking in his own defense. In the eyes of the English court, he was an outlaw, existing outside the law's protection. To mock his ambition, his captors placed a crown of laurel leaves on his head. The charges were read. He was accused of atrocities against civilians during the war. But the primary, most damning charge was high treason. The Chief Justice, Sir Peter Mallory, formally accused Wallace of betraying his king. It was at this moment, denied any other right to speak, that Wallace shouted the rebuttal that would echo through history. "I cannot be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject." He had sworn no allegiance, and therefore, in his own mind, he could not be a traitor. It was a stunning declaration of principle in the face of certain death. It made no difference. The guilty verdict was a foregone conclusion. The sentence was read, a sentence designed not merely for execution, but for complete annihilation. The punishment began immediately. Before the blades and the fire, there was shame. On that same day, Wallace was taken from Westminster Hall, stripped naked and bound to a wooden hurdle. He was then dragged by horses through the crowded, filthy streets of London. This was no swift journey. It was a parade of degradation that stretched for miles to the execution site at Smithfield. King Edward I had effectively turned the death of his greatest enemy into a public event. The streets were lined with spectators who had gathered to witness the downfall of the infamous Scottish rebel. They jeered, screamed insults, and pelted his exposed body with rotten food and waste. This was a calculated part of the punishment, designed to dehumanize him, to strip away the legend and show the world that this great warrior was nothing more than a common criminal being dragged through the mud. It was intended to break his spirit, to make him beg, to erode his dignity so completely that there would be nothing left for the executioner but a terrified, broken man. By all accounts, Wallace endured this ordeal with stoic resolve. The crown wanted a spectacle of a cowering traitor receiving his just deserts. Instead, the crowd witnessed a man facing unimaginable humiliation with a fortitude that likely unsettled his tormentors. The first act of his execution was underway, a deliberate campaign of public shaming meant to crush his soul before they even began to touch his body. When the agonizing procession ended at Smithfield, the true physical horror was set to begin. What followed was the prescribed punishment for high treason, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Each step was a deliberate act of both physical torture and political symbolism. First, the hanging. Wallace was hauled onto the gallows, but this was not meant to be a swift death. He was hanged by a noose to inflict the maximum amount of pain without killing him, slowly strangling him to the point of suffocation. Just as he was about to lose consciousness, he was cut down, still gasping, and laid upon the scaffold. The hanging was merely the preamble. Next came the drawing. While Wallace was still alive, the executioner sliced open his abdomen and emasculated him, a symbolic act meant to communicate that this traitor S-line was finished. Following this came the disembowelment. His internal organs, his intestines, liver, and heart were pulled from his body. Medieval chroniclers claim these organs were then thrown into a fire and burned before his eyes, a symbolic damnation to ensure the traitor could find no peace in the afterlife. It was only after this prolonged, unimaginable agony that any semblance of mercy was shown. As Wallace was finally succumbing to his horrific injuries, the executioner ended his suffering with a beheading. But the grotesque message was not yet complete. His now lifeless body was hacked into 4 pieces. The quartering was the final political statement. The annihilation of William Wallace was complete, or so King Edward thought. It is in understanding these brutal details that we move past the myth and see the true measure of historical events. If you believe in uncovering the unvarnished truths of the past, take a moment to subscribe and join us as we explore more stories shaped by power, rebellion, and sacrifice. King Edward's plan was meticulous. Each gruesome step of the execution was a piece of political communication. Wallace's head was dipped in tar for preservation, and then impaled on a spike atop London Bridge, a grisly warning to all who entered the city. The 4 quarters of his body were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, to be displayed publicly as a rotting reminder of the price of defying England. The intended message was clear. This is the fate of traitors. Fear is the new law of the land. For a short time, it seemed to work. The sheer brutality of the act sent a shockwave of terror through Scotland. But Edward, in his ruthless calculation, had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He failed to understand the alchemy of martyrdom. The horror of Wallace's death did not ultimately breed submission. It cultivated a deep and burning rage. Instead of a warning, the distributed body parts became relics. Instead of symbols of fear, they became symbols of sacrifice. The story of Wallace's defiance at his trial, his endurance through humiliation, and the unspeakable cruelty of his death spread like wildfire. The spectacle backfired spectacularly. The English king had hoped to kill a man and an idea, but in doing so, he had fused them together forever. The cause of Scottish independence now had a martyr. It had a name and a face for its pain and its anger. The very act designed to crush the rebellion became its most potent rallying cry. Among those who observed these events was a Scottish noble, Robert the Bruce. While his motivations were complex, the execution of Wallace is said to have been a galvanizing force, proving that there could be no peace with such a king. Edward had silenced one rebel, but in doing so, he had helped awaken a king. The legacy of William Wallace is defined not by the battles he won or lost, but by the manner of his death. King Edward I set out to make Wallace an example, and he succeeded, just not in the way he had planned. The execution was meant to be the final chapter of a failed rebellion. Instead, it became the prologue to a renewed and ultimately successful war for independence. Just 7 months later, in 1306, Robert the Bruce had himself crowned King of Scots and rekindled the war. The memory of Wallace's sacrifice fueled the Scottish armies. The brutality that was meant to terrify them only hardened their resolve. 14 years after Wallace's body was scattered across the kingdom, Robert the Bruce secured a decisive victory over the English at the Battle of Bannockburn, a victory that would eventually lead to Scotland's recognized independence. William Wallace became more powerful in death than he ever was in life. His story, amplified by the horror of his end, transformed from history into a foundational myth for a nation. He became the eternal symbol of the fight for freedom against impossible odds. The attempt to physically annihilate William Wallace only served to sow the seeds of his legend in the very soil his enemies sought to control. They scattered the man, but in doing so, they spread the message, and that message was freedom.